that the patterns at the largest level are reflected in the patterns at the smallest level. Life and existence is this incredible mystery. And part of what we're here to do is experience many, many different facets of it.
Why'd you go atheist? It's a lot easier to believe that there is not a God rather than to believe he hates you.
I was struck by lightning.
Life and existence is this incredible mystery.
I want to be able to show people that like the gospel is cool and like God is cool.
That's the point of life, is the I don't know, but I believe.
I know there's a lot of people who don't really understand much about the Red Road. I am one of those people. And so I would love to be able to ask you kind of from a very authentic way, from an authentic place, to just ask as many questions as we can about the Red Road and try to kind of understand the Red Road a little bit more altogether as you kind of can help us understand a little bit more by explaining what the Red Road is. But if you wanted to kind of start off by a little bit just about yourself and kind of, first of all, why we're on Zoom and we're not in person right now. So maybe a little about where you're from, your career path, and then kind of dive a little bit into the Red Road with us.
Cool. Absolutely. So I'm originally from El Paso, Texas. I was born and raised in El Paso, and in my late teen years, I moved to Las Cruces, New Mexico, which is not very far from El Paso, but it's southern New Mexico, and I think my whole life I've had more of an affinity for this area than being in the city in El Paso where I grew up. But so my parents are both from Chihuahua, from the state of Chihuahua, northern Mexico, and growing up, I grew up pretty much like 1 foot over here and 1 foot over there, in a manner of speaking. In my home, everything was pretty traditional Mexican. And then, going to school here, I was growing up biculturally, basically, between a very traditional Mexican upbringing and then schooling and the rest of culture right here in the States. When I was a kid, when I was about 10 years old, I started learning about my indigenous heritage. On my mom's side, my mother's mother was of Inde lineage or Apache lineage, and when I was really little and I first started learning about that, it just sparked this massive interest that has shaped my entire life, really. Yeah. So I currently live in southern New Mexico again. If we're gonna talk about all the many winding aspects of the path, we'd be here for a long time. But to make that story a little less long, my work is centered on helping people heal from ancestral trauma and the effects and impacts on ancestral trauma. And I started doing this work in my early 20s because it was absolutely necessary for myself. Right. There were a lot of things that I experienced throughout my life growing up that I didn't have much cultural support or understanding for. And some of those things had to do with things that nowadays people are speaking about more and more, right? These concepts of generational and intergenerational trauma, epigenetics, and how like trauma is passed from parent to child, basically, and like compounds down lineages. So in my early 20s, my like mid-teens to early 20s were a really difficult time for me. Right. And I was like essentially self-destructing because of all of these different things that I was carrying that I had no real frame of reference for, and no sense of support right? That
Right.
not any sense of support that I trusted, by the way. Which, if we can get further into this, like throughout our conversation, we'll talk a lot about the differences between traditional approaches to healing and more conventional approaches to healing, specifically things like trauma and like the mental health field and
Okay.
where it falls short in a lot of different ways.
Yeah.
But I had always had this really strong interest in native traditions and also really, really strong interest in spirituality. And that's something that has been a part of me as far as I can remember. It's not necessarily something that I could specifically tie to any event or any person, so much as to say that my like spiritual pull or calling has always been there. But from a very young age, I developed a very healthy mistrust of institutionalized or organized religion, and a lot of it was intuitive with me, and a lot of it too was the more I learned about things that my family had been through and things that my ancestors had been through, the more I hungered for their ways of understanding life and relationship and our interconnectedness with the cosmos, and the less the conventional narratives really spoke to me.
Right.
So in my early 20s, I had a series of experiences that I shouldn't have walked away from. And I was in like a few different car accidents. I had multiple different experiences, right, that landed me in the hospital, or landed me in legal trouble. And a lot of those things I came to find like were me acting out these really self-destructive patterns that had a generational component to it, or had an ancestral component to it. It's like I was acting out the same kinds of self-destructive things that I had seen specifically men in my lineage, right, act out in their own lives or be a part of in their own lives.
When you say act out,
and,
what exactly do you mean by acting out?
I mean things that they embodied in their choices and in their actions, right? A lot of my work centers on addiction and the struggles that people have with addiction. And primarily we're talking about alcohol and drug addiction, but it extends much further than that, right? Way beyond that. The root of addiction in people is much deeper than the individual that it manifests in.
Right.
And it's very much woven into or rooted in the generational history of the family and the family's capacity to, or incapacity to, actively deal with the untended emotions that are associated with traumatic experiences or traumatic environments. And a big part of my work, all of this is woven into my story. So a big part of my work is realizing that every single generation of every family has one person that is more sensitive than the rest to the unhealed trauma of their lineage. And that person in intact cultures like what we're going to be talking about, in intact cultures, that person would be recognized at a very young age for having the potential to become the healer for their village or community or tribe because of that extra sensitivity that they have. And I over the years, I started calling that person the grief bearer, like the one that carries the grief or the untended
Right.
grief of the family. We don't have a cultural understanding for that in our time and place in society. So generally what ends up happening is that that person with that extra sensitivity ends up getting pushed to the side, or ends up being like ostracized or rejected, because in our culture, expressing emotion, really, I was going to say expressing excessive emotion, but expressing emotion, period, is something that isn't that socially acceptable unless
Right.
it's certain emotions, right?
Right.
Like nowadays, the expression of rage, for example, is very much socially encouraged. But there are other aspects of emotion that people don't know how to express in healthy ways. And then we have these cultural stigmas that get attached to those emotions too, that make people just choke it down. So in intact cultures, there's this understanding that when you choke down those emotions, when you don't fully allow yourself to process, right, the emotional responses for what you've been through, those emotions, they stay stuck in your body. And they are like water that doesn't flow. Whenever water doesn't flow, it stagnates, right? And when it stagnates, it breeds sickness. So in these intact cultures, emotion and water are intimately connected. Water is intimately connected with emotion and memory. And if you think about it, it makes sense, because whenever we have any strong emotional response, water tends to leak out of us, right? So if people are extremely happy, they'll weep, right? If they're extremely sad, they'll weep. If they get anxious or nervous, a lot of times people's hands will sweat or their bodies will start sweating.
Right.
If they get excited in other ways, other fluids flow from the body, right?
Right.
And so in these cultures, there's this understanding that water and emotion are intimately connected. So when a person doesn't express or doesn't process the emotional component to an experience that they've had, those waters stay in their body. They stay stuck in their body, and they start to stagnate. They start to grow stale. And just like, if you're out going for a hike and you came across a pool of water that had just been sitting there for days or weeks, you know how it smells. And you wouldn't really think to take a drink of that water, right? Because if you drink it, you're going to get sick. Well, from this perspective, if we don't allow for those waters that are associated with those emotions to flow, those waters start to breed sickness inside. And it's a sickness of the heart, right? It's a sickness of the soul, if we want to think of it that way. And that soul sickness starts to permeate every aspect of the person's life that carries it.
Okay. I have a question.
And then it starts to leak out. Yeah.
Sorry. So
Yeah, go ahead.
for me in my life, I've noticed I tend to not cry often, and maybe it's a cultural thing or something. I mean, I personally am from the UK, and in the UK they try to hide away their emotions often, and my family we're kind of, it's more so told to hide away your emotions and to not talk about them as much. And so for someone like myself, as a child growing up, I cried all the time. I was always whining and crying. It was a different kind of crying, but it was more of a whiny kind of cry. But once I got to a certain age, I just stopped crying. And I think since maybe I was 10 or 11, I just haven't cried since. And I've always wondered to myself, and I've always tried speaking with a few different, I try to talk to girls more specifically because I feel like they have a better understanding of their emotions than men typically do. And so I tried asking and trying to figure out how do I cry? How can I let these emotions out? Because I kind of feel that same thing that you're talking about, where I feel like that those emotions are building up inside and I want to be able to release them and in some healthy way. And so I feel like I've noticed that exact same thing for myself. And even, I don't know if this has anything to do with it, but our muscles, for instance, we take lots of water into our muscles.
Oh, for sure.
And at times when I'm very, very stressed, my muscles tense up, especially in my back. And I get huge, huge knots in my back because I notice that I'm extremely stressed for whatever reason. And so I think that's so interesting that you bring all that up, and something that I honestly have thought a lot about too, but I never thought about it as the water. That's a new thing that I've also been thinking about. Along with that, I've also heard a podcast recently with Andrew Huberman, if you know who that is. And he was talking about how our water that comes out of our eyes is made out of certain molecular construct of the water that comes out of our eyes can sometimes be therapeutic and like medicine. And he was talking about there's no wonder how they're right above your mouth and they just drip right into your mouth just perfectly. And so I find it interesting how you're explaining all this.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it is very much a culturally influenced thing that keeps us from knowing how to grieve, from knowing how to weep. And just a quick aside, grief is so much more than sorrow. Like grief is so much more than feeling sadder than weeping. But speaking specifically to the weeping aspect of it, it's interesting because in all of the work that I've done, I dived into the history of where this comes from, like where the idea that the absence of emotion equals strength comes from. And it actually has a pretty wicked history.
Okay.
It's related to colonization, but it's related to earlier phases of what people think of as colonization. And it has everything to do with the spreading of the Roman Catholic Church during the Roman Empire. And the way that the Romans in their empire building were seeking to dominate and integrate other places and other peoples into their empire. And they did it by belief or by force.
Interesting.
And so there's a lot to the advent of monotheistic religion as a dominant force, as a political institution, let's say, more than a spiritual one, but as a political drive. The use of the idea of monotheism to justify the wholesale slaughter and extermination in some cases and colonization in other cases of indigenous people has everything to do with the belief that was later adopted that to not weep or not show expressions of grief is a signal or a symbol of strength. Because essentially what the Romans would do when they were on these campaigns and that spread throughout, I mean, what was the known world at that time, right? Was they would come in, and if they met any resistance from an indigenous group, they would wipe out the bulk of them through force, and those that survived, they would give them the option to either become Romans on the spot or be wiped out, right? And there came a point where becoming Roman meant adopting the Roman Catholic faith. And if a person adopted that faith, they were no longer able or allowed to weep for their loved ones that had just been killed, that died as pagans. So let's say someone comes and wipes out your whole town or your whole village, and you're one of a handful of people that are left. And they tell you, in order for us not to kill you, you have to accept these belief systems. And part of these belief systems are that you are no longer connected to all of these people around you. that have been
Right.
everything to you up until this point.
Right.
So you can't express your grief for them. Because if you do, then that means you're one of them, and that means that we can kill you.
Interesting.
So not weeping was a matter of life and death. And in that sense, in that specific context, to not weep, to hold back the rage and the helplessness and the fear and the sorrow to boot of having witnessed your entire way of life wiped out in front of your eyes, and having witnessed people that you love being killed in front of your eyes, having to choke all of that down became a symbol of strength.
Right.
But so what the Romans would do was for the men, they would immediately conscript the men into the Roman army and say, your home is no longer this ancestral home that your people have had for hundreds or thousands of years.
Mm-hmm.
Now your home is this idea. It's not a place that you have a tangible relationship with. It's an idea, an abstraction that follows you wherever you go.
Right.
And in doing that, they would essentially make those people orphans, physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. And then they would send them to do exactly what had been done to them to other people.
Yeah.
This was what was done to the men.
Right.
Okay. So we can start to track this cultural idea that to weep is a sign of weakness in men all the way back to that.
Interesting.
And we're talking about hundreds, in some places, over 1,000, close to 2,000 years, or in some places actually more than 2,000 years, of this mindset, and also the impacts of this mindset being passed from generation to generation to generation to generation.
Yeah.
Now, there's also that aspect that I was talking about the water not flowing. So when emotion is stuck in somebody that experiences something like that, some really intense traumatic event, well, now it's not just traumatic events, right? It's also traumatizing environments that we have been starting to talk about more and more. There's a whole group of psychologists that are trying to push the acceptance of something that they're calling developmental trauma disorder, which isn't a specific event that caused the trauma response in the person, but it's the consistent exposure to a traumatizing environment.
Yeah.
But so let's say the initial person that experienced that traumatizing event, if they don't have the safety, the community, and the guidance to be able to process that trauma, then those waters that hold all of those emotions, they stay stuck in the person. They start to poison that person. And that person starts to manifest it as violence. And that violence is first and foremost oriented inward. And then it spills outward towards others. And so when we're talking about violence in that way, we have to think about the entire spectrum, from emotional violence, which can be really subtle, which can be very, passive aggressive and more covert, to outright forms of physical violence.
Right.
And that violence, as it grows in the person, it creates this strong sense of separation between them and the environment they live in, and the people that they live in or live with, I should say.
Right.
And that continues to compound the traumatizing circumstances in their life, because as they're guarding themselves and trying to keep all of that hurt
Inside.
at bay, The inside, exactly. They start fearing that other people are going to see what they're carrying,
Yeah.
which creates this impulse to push other people away outside.
Interesting.
And so the hiding the thing leads to the person fearing being seen as someone that's carrying the thing, and then starts to lead to all of these different kinds of resentful and defensive behaviors in that person, which then creates pushback from the people that they're interacting with, and creates this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, or this dynamic where the person gets caught in this loop of feeling threatened by the world, so they push the world away, and then the world responds to the way they're pushing the world away, so that reinforces the idea of feeling threatened, and it just compounds the thing. And so people start to develop this sense of distancing from each other, and at the same time, the sense of distancing from themselves, because they don't want to see or feel what's beneath the surface, because it's so painful, and there's no support outside for them to be able to process it.
Yeah.
So that affects how they treat their children. I mean, it affects the person that they choose, or people that they choose to have children with to begin with. So generally they'll tend to align themselves or get together with other people that have a similar experience.
Right.
Then they have children, and then collectively between the two of them, all of their unprocessed grief gets poured into their children. Except that when we make the switch from one generation to the next, the trauma-based behavior of the first generation becomes normalized. So when their kids are growing up in their environment, their kids know nothing but that environment. So to their kids, that environment is normal.
Right.
So they don't even know to look.
Sorry. In some respect, it's also like looking back at like my parents, for instance, coming from the UK. It could come from years of war in the past with England, with other countries, and having to deal with that, which is passed down generation to generation to my parents, who then pass it on to me. But this makes me think, you said it's usually passed on more specifically, or one person is more prone to it in the family, like one of the children specifically. What exactly do you mean by that? Is it, how do we usually know what person that is, or is there a traditional way of knowing who that person is?
Yeah, the biggest indicator nowadays is the person that becomes the black sheep of the family.
Okay.
You know, that saying, or that way of relating to people, the person that seems to struggle, let's say, with following along the pattern of life that society has laid out for other people, the more kind of conventional checklist of what a life is supposed to look like.
Right. So
this person, which I call the grief bearer, right? So the grief bearer of their lineage is the person that from their earliest days outwardly demonstrates a greater sensitivity to things than other people on an emotional level. Okay. And a lot of times they're the person that's like the emotional glue of a family. As they grow up, they're the one that, for whatever reason, others feel comfortable coming and bringing their problems to. They're the ones that will be really sensitive to the ways that others are feeling, and try to, I mean, especially in children when they're smaller, they'll instinctually try to comfort everyone around them. And you see that in outward expressions of affection, right? Hugs and things like that, like things that the person will do in an attempt to ease what is beneath the surface of the person that they're engaging with or interacting with. This makes life really, really tricky because in this culture and in the society that we live in, like I was saying earlier, people are not supposed to outwardly express what they're feeling.
Right.
There's this general cultural push towards the appearance of normalcy or towards the appearance of competence in a person's life. So whether we're explicitly or implicitly taught this, we are expected to walk around looking like we've got everything together.
Right.
And at the same time, a person can be internally falling apart while they seem to be managing all of those things that society says that they're supposed to be managing.
Right.
So they're going to work, they're paying their bills, they're whatever, curating their Instagram feed the perfect way or whatever it may be. But
Right.
inside, they're carrying all of this stuff that they haven't processed and all of this stuff that was passed on to them that hasn't been processed too.
Yeah.
And let's say that person has a kid and the kid sees behind the mask intuitively or feels behind the mask intuitively. And that kid keeps trying to comfort what the person does not want to acknowledge is there. What ends up happening is that kid starts to experience rejection from a really young age, from those people that do not want to have to face what they've got going on beneath the surface
Interesting.
and do not want others to see that there's something other than that face of competence that they're wearing going on
Right.
there. So this person in their generation, I should say, this person in their generation will start to experience a kind of rejection from the people around them from a really young age. And it's a very subtle thing. It can be a very subtle thing. Like I'm saying, it can be as subtle as just like the nonverbal communication of not wanting to be around that person to very overt forms of violence and abuse.
Right.
So at a certain age, the grief bearer internalizes that rejection. So the first few years of life, they're experiencing it from the outside, but there comes a certain point where this awareness or this feeling of not fitting in becomes very consciously apparent to that person.
Yeah.
And as that person grows, they develop this mutual rejection for the outside world that they feel rejected by, but also rejection towards themselves for not understanding why they don't seem to fit in with that larger outside world. And so that's this really specific recipe for isolation and self-destruction and it can also manifest not just as self-destruction. It can also manifest as somebody that becomes obsessed with achievement, because that feeling rejected by the world can also trigger in somebody the desire to seek achievement as much as possible in order to try and receive the recognition from the people around them that they didn't get otherwise.
Right.
So it can split in various different ways. So this is the core of my work. It's the core of the work that I do with people in the world.
Right.
And it's really interesting because it is something that impacts people across social, economic, and cultural and age divides, right?
Right.
It's or spectra, I should say. It's really interesting because a lot of times, like I work a lot with people that are in recovery from addiction, and a lot of times there's this stigma in society that people that are struggling with addiction are of a certain social class or of a certain culture, and it's really not true. It's something that you see happen across the board. And when you start to get into the roots of it, at least with me, I've found over and over again, I've worked with hundreds of people. I found over and over again that these people that have these outwardly, or that have these behaviors that seem to outwardly manifest as self-destructive behaviors, or as high achieving behaviors, have at the root of them this sense of feeling unseen and not enough.
Right.
And so I became really interested in all of this in my early 20s, because if I didn't learn all of this stuff, I wouldn't be here anymore.
Right.
The lifestyle that I was living at that point in time, everything changed for me one night when I caused a car accident, and was being looked after, I think, in a very specific way that allowed for me not to die that night. I should have died in that car accident.
Wow.
And I didn't.
What happened?
I didn't. It was, so I had been wrestling with a lot of this stuff that I'm talking about in my lifetime.
Right.
And I was driving late at night. Actually, no, it wasn't really that late. But I was driving at night after having spent a day drinking with friends of mine.
Yeah.
I had no business being behind the wheel of the car.
Right.
And yeah, I lost control of the car and went through a fence, and my car stopped about 3 feet shy of hitting a power generator.
Wow.
And that would have been it.
Wow.
And something in me clicked that night.
Yeah.
And shifted my perception on a lot of different things. And there are aspects to that night that really reinforced my sense of spiritual awareness. But beyond that, this awareness that the way that I had been living my life up until that point was based on a lot of these cultural stories that get passed on to us that are responses to the unhealed trauma of our cultures and our people.
Right.
And I realized, like, that night that I had 2 potential paths ahead of me. And one of them was going to just lead to a long life of suffering and a lot of misery, not just for me, but for everybody around me. And the other path was to decide to take full responsibility for myself and for where I was in my life, for what had happened, for what I had done leading up to the events of that night. And to dedicate my life to healing the roots of that destructiveness in me, so that I could take what I learned and share it with as many people as possible.
Right.
And that I was 21 when that happened. I'm 43 now.
So my age.
Like subsequent to make, yeah. So subsequent to like making that decision, I was, somebody gave me a book in jail.
Wow.
And it was a book by a author named Carlos Castañeda that was really popular in the late 60s and early 70s. He wrote books throughout all the way into the 90s. But Castañeda's books are the stories of his apprenticeship with a person that he said was a Yaqui healer, or a Yaqui shaman. A Yaqui sorcerer was what the books originally said. They've since changed the word sorcerer in some of the books to shaman, but
Right.
but so there were these stories about his apprenticeship with this Toltec teacher, and I had known about those books because I had started reading them when I was about 14 years old, so about 7 years prior to this happening. I had already started reading those books. I'd had this interest. I'd started studying the Toltec tradition when I was about 10.
Oh wow.
It was when that really sparked in me. I think, like I was saying earlier, when I was a kid, I was really drawn towards spirituality, like from the beginning, from the get-go. But I was really drawn towards these forms of nature-based or earth-based spirituality.
Gotcha.
And I wanted to connect with those spiritual traditions that were associated with my ancestry, with my lineage. And at that time, I really leaned into or favored my Native American and Mexican, which is also indigenous to an extent, right? Indigenous heritage as well, because I also have ancestry from Europe. But so when I was 21 and this person gave me that book in the situation that I was in, it was just perfect at this pivotal moment. And the guy that gave me the book, I had been moved from the cell that I was in to the cell that this guy was in. And I'd been in that cell for like a couple hours, and the guy hadn't said anything to me, but I saw that he was reading that book. And I thought to myself, like, what the hell is that book doing in here?
Yeah.
I didn't know at that point that in jail, everybody's is innocent, rich on the outside, and super spiritual. And I mean, these are the stories they'll tell you, right? But so I was really, but so I was really blown away. I was like, why is there this book on spirituality in here?
Right.
And this really interesting thing happened where at a certain point, without saying anything else to each other, this guy closes the book and sits up, turns around and looks at me and hands me the book and says, "You need to read this." And he gives me this book. And like a couple hours later, they come and get him and move him out of the cell. I have no idea what the guy's name is. Never figured that out. But I started reading this book, and it's a book that's called Tales of Power, by the way. I think it's the 4th book in the series. But I started reading this book, and what really spoke to me wasn't so much the story in the book as the gist of the teachings beneath it.
Okay.
And really a large part of that whole series of books is the idea that our perception creates our reality.
Right.
And that we are never a victim really to anything other than ourselves and our own thoughts. And I mean, that stuff nowadays, so many people say that. There's all of this meme spirituality out there where so many people like keep reinforcing these ideas and talking about manifestation, like 5th dimensional, this and that and the other. Well, I was reading this at a time where none of this was popular, where nobody was interested in any of these things. Yeah. And that had been a big part of my life too. Like I started studying about shamanism and healing traditions in that vein.
Yeah. Again,
when I was really young. So like throughout middle school and high school and college,
really?
I was one of very few people that were interested in any of this.
Right.
Like the explosion and popularization of spirituality that we have now. And it's funny because in certain circles, right, everyone you talk to is either a shaman, a yogi, or a witch, right? Or a psychic, whatever. It's become this big thing in popular culture. And it wasn't like that, 20 years ago.
Uh-huh.
And so it was interesting. I remember reading that book and feeling this it was almost like just this like realization, this reality just like slapped me in the face.
Yeah.
And and all of a sudden I started entertaining that idea. And I mean, I felt like it was a matter of life and death. But considering the idea that all of the conditions that had led to where I was at that point in my life, you know, wrestling really, really badly with depression, with anxiety, with a completely out of control relationship with alcohol, with
Right.
many different self-destructive tendencies in my life. Realizing that all of that was based on the choices that I was making in the present moment. That
Yeah.
I could look at traumatic experiences that I'd been in my life and say, okay, that impacted me in these ways,
Right.
but I'm not in that situation anymore. I'm not in that situation anywhere but in my own mind. And there are, like earlier I was saying, this idea that, or I mentioned something to the extent, right, that people can't be victims. And that's not to say that people can't experience events that are outside of their control where they are victimized.
Mm-hmm.
It's to say that past the event that victimizes the person, what anchors in the mentality of being a victim has a lot to do with the cultural, social, and internal dynamics that govern that person's life. It has to do with the way that they perceive themselves in the world and their interactions with other people. And there's this really interesting phenomenon where you'll have two people experience the exact same traumatizing event, and one person will use that as a reason to wreck the rest of their life, and another person will use that as the reason to completely transform their life,
Right.
completely
Right.
turn it around.
Yeah.
So for me, when I was in that situation, I was reading that book, a few things happened. And the first was that it clicked for me that I had been studying all of these different teachings for, at that point, half of my life.
Mm-hmm.
And I hadn't been fully applying them. I'd been warehousing knowledge for knowledge's sake, in a way.
Right.
But I hadn't actually been applying the things that I'd been learning.
Right.
The next thing that happened is that I made this full commitment to dive into that knowledge and to put it into practice and to uproot the sources of my own self-destructive behavior.
Right.
And so that set me on this whole other path. So
Wow.
so to make to move the story along a little bit, because of that situation, I spent a couple months in jail.
Yeah.
In the time that I was there, I started reconstructing what my life was going to be mentally.
Yeah.
When I left, I really held that mentality, and I changed a whole lot of things in my life. I mean, starting with the social circle I was in.
Yeah.
But within a year and a half, I was finishing my undergrad degree. At like the top of my class, I was like consecutively on the dean's list and things like that.
Wow.
I had taught myself another language. I taught myself Portuguese in that year and a half because I
Wow.
became obsessed with Brazil and Brazilian culture, and my first language is Spanish, and so Spanish and Portuguese have a lot of similarities. And so I came out of that situation with this mindset that not only was I gonna like bounce back, but I was gonna accomplish things that nobody in my family, in my lineage had done. And I was gonna get to the source or the root of what had been destroying me,
Right.
and turn around and help as many people do the same as possible. And so I became obsessed with this Brazilian art called capoeira, and like threw myself into that
Yeah.
wholeheartedly. Learned Portuguese, and I got a full fellowship to a PhD at Brown University.
Yeah.
And so I ended up going and living in Brazil for a time,
wow.
and training the art that I wanted to in Brazil, and then and studying Brazilian spiritual traditions over there.
Oh, wow.
And then came back and went to grad school, and I finished my PhD there, and the whole focus of my PhD was how intact cultures use storytelling and ritual to help individuals and to help like communities heal from trauma. And so I had all of these different interests in consciousness, in spirituality, and in healing, and how all of these things can come together to help people essentially survive the kinds of things that I went through and I put myself through.
Right.
So all of that, right, to come back to the idea of the Red Road. The term the Red Road is used now as an umbrella for Native American spiritual traditions.
Yeah.
But it's that umbrella it includes various different tribes. Like you'll find, like when people refer to the Red Road, a lot of times it's a lot of times it's referring to Lakota, Lakota, Dakota, Nakota, and around here where we are in New Mexico, it overlaps and includes Dene people.
Right.
But in a lot of ways, that idea of the Red Road encompasses certain philosophies or understandings of living and being that are what I'm talking about when I talk about intact cultures. Now, one of the stories of the Red Road that really sits with me, that has spoken to me more than anything, is that this concept of the Red Road originally comes from the Toltecs. And when I say Toltec, if you go through like the mainstream avenues of history and anthropology, you're gonna find a lot of misleading stuff.
Okay.
A lot.
Okay.
Because most history is based on misinterpretations that are then reinterpreted many different ways and have been, throughout time. The word Tolteca is a word that is generally most ascribed or associated with people of the Valley of Mexico, the central Valley of Mexico, around where Mexico City is now.
Okay.
But then people will say, well, the actual Tolteca tribe, or the Toltecs, are from what's now the city of Tula in the state of Hidalgo in Mexico. But that's not exactly correct. The word Tolteca or Toltec refers to a person that is committed to knowledge, a person that is committed to understanding and wisdom, and the growth of understanding and wisdom in themselves and in the world around them. And in the oral tradition, there's a lot about and also in the written stuff, there's a lot about the fact that these wise people, or these people who were committed to wisdom, traveled and interacted from the tip of South America in Tierra del Fuego, all the way up to the northernmost tip of Alaska. And so there were these interchanges of of um, of art and technology and tradition and culture and spirituality.
Yeah.
So the idea of the red road is connected to all of this, and one of the main aspects of that story of the red road that I really appreciate is that it's called the red road because it's associated with our blood, and the idea, and this is one of the interpretations of it. Okay, I want to be really, really clear that there are various different ways of looking at it, and people get really attached to the way that they perceive and interpret and define these things. So I want to make clear that this is one of them, and it's the one that really speaks to me. But so the idea of the red road, right? In the Toltec tradition, there's this concept that's called esli, and it's the term for our blood. But the idea there is that our blood is the most vital force or vital essence that exists. So it's incredibly precious, right? Our blood, the blood of anything, any living being, is literally, life essence made tangible. In the course of our lives, we're born carrying the potentials that our ancestors passed on to us. Some of those potentials are life affirming. Some of those potentials are for life. They benefit life, ours, and through our life, the lives of other people or other beings, to not just isolate it to humans.
Yeah.
Some of the potentials that we inherit are life devouring, right? Or life destroying.
Okay.
So within us, we have an ancestral legacy that includes both creative and destructive aspects.
Okay.
And it is our responsibility in our lives to transform or to heal as many of those destructive aspects so that we then do not pass them on to the future generations. And so the idea of the red road or walking the red road for me has everything to do with healing the familial and cultural legacies of trauma, of violence, of hatred, of pain, of unnecessary pain, essentially. And in order to do that, we have to learn how to live in an intact way. So this is where we start to get into the whole aspect of spirituality. Spirituality as a term is really tricky because it separates a series of practices and beliefs from other things.
Right.
So spirituality becomes something that is put into a specific container. And for some people, that container is church, right? For other people, that container is science. For other people, that container is nature, right?
Right.
Well, when people have their spirituality tied up in a container, it's only as useful as their frequency of visiting that container, right? So like if I take my idea of spirituality and I'm like, it exists just here, then I'm only going to be connected with it or experience it just there. If you think about it that way.
Okay.
From the perspective or from my perspective, I should say again, there's no separating it. There's no such thing as my spiritual life and then my practical life.
Okay.
Or my spiritual life or my professional life. Like, it is woven through every single aspect of being.
Right.
Through every single aspect of your life. A big part of healing all of that legacy of wounding that I was talking about
Right.
is the fact that we are earthlings first and foremost. We belong to this planet. We are made of this planet, and our existence is intimately connected to what happens to this planet. Earlier, I was talking about how when the Roman Empire would take over the lands of these indigenous people, they would destroy their sacred places. I don't know if I did mention that actually, but they would destroy their sacred places, and they would do everything to destroy their connection to the land specifically. That wound of separation between the people and the land is a cultural legacy that we all carry. Every single one of us. It doesn't matter if your people came from Britain or from West Africa or from Taiwan or from Mexico. All of us in the modern world carry the wound of separation from nature. To the extent that we think that there's us and then there's nature. Well, from this way of living, there's absolutely no separation whatsoever. We are expressions of nature. And one of the big sources of dis-ease, and when I say dis-ease, I mean like D-I-S hyphen ease, right? In all forms, is the sense of spiritual homelessness that people have because they feel separate from natural cycles and rhythms. They don't have direct contact with the places where they live. And beyond that, they have very little understanding of what it means to be living as a part of these immensely intricate webs of life and death that surround us everywhere. So one of the most important points in shifting the wounding that most modern people feel, that they can't even put their finger on, they can't even name it, but it's there, is remembering that we are meant to live in alignment with the cycles of nature. And beyond that, that everything that exists in nature has a consciousness to it.
Right.
And that consciousness is something that we can learn from, but it's something that is so much older than us as well, that we're like the young ones in relation to it. We're the toddlers in relation to it. And so a lot of the work of healing these ancestral wounds starts with learning how to reintegrate ourselves into the natural environment, learning how to rebalance our ways of life and our rhythms with life, learning how to reestablish a sense of reverence for life with the capital L beyond our individual life with the lowercase l. So in organized religions or in dominant religions, people have this idea of God as being something that is a lot of the times outside and is watching and judging from outside.
Right.
And that like in the Abrahamic traditions, so the idea of God as judge is central. And the idea that our actions and our behavior have to follow the rules or the laws of that force that is witnessing us. Otherwise, we're going to be rewarded or punished accordingly, right?
Right.
It changes a lot of people's perspectives on personal responsibility. And it changes a lot of people's perspectives on maturation, on growing up. Because if you live your whole life from this position that there is some parental figure that is watching you to make sure that you do the right thing, then there's no incentive for you to inherently do the right thing just because it's the right thing.
Right.
You're doing the right thing so that you don't suffer for not doing it, which is a kind of coercion.
Yeah. I find that interesting because coming from my perspective, being raised in Christianity, right? A lot of what I have experienced as church comes from exactly what you're explaining. A lot of the time it feels like organized religion can a lot of ways really hurt people in a lot of ways, because it makes them feel like that they aren't enough in some way because they can't live up to the rules or the expectations of what has been set in front of them. And for me, for instance, over the last few years of my life, spirituality has become more and more important for me, and is a big reason as to why I do this podcast now, is because to me, spirituality is so much more than just one set organization or one set thing. It's a way of being. It's a way of feeling. When we read the New Testament and we see what Jesus Christ brought to the world, he brought a higher law in a way. He was calling everyone out who had organized religion, and I think I find it interesting how organized religion is usually organized around somebody's experience. It's usually not so much of a feeling and a way of living. It's more of someone has built an organization to build up a foundation or a building or a church or a religion around somebody's experience that they had that was really big, right? Jesus Christ, Buddha, Muhammad, all these big people who had crazy experiences. And I find it interesting how now for myself, looking at what Jesus Christ said when he came to the world, he came and said, hey, all these organized religions that you guys have created, you guys are just limiting yourself with these rules and laws that you're setting in front of you. Yeah. Whereas he's more like trying to tell us that there's a higher way of living, and every single day in and out, we should be reading, we should be praying, we should be meditating and thinking more deeply about what it is we're doing every single day, rather than just trying to live in expectation every single day. Check off the checkbox of I did this, I did this, I did this. It's more of a way of feeling. It's following our heart a little bit more. And I find that part of it to be very, very interwoven and connected to the same that the Red Road teaches, where people are really trying to connect with nature, with their spirit and everyone else's spirits. It's not so much trying to build up this big church, it's not like it has like a ton of money going towards it. It's more of what you're really getting out of it, and the things that you're learning and able to do with it, and the things that you're learning from it, which I find to be very, very related to the things that Jesus Christ taught back in the day. And it's something that I feel has been lost over time, for sure.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's really interesting because if people were really to dive into and study Christ was the ultimate rebel. I mean, during Christ's time, Christ was the one that was there disrupting the status quo. That's why they killed him.
Yes.
Not because he was going along with the plan, and not because he was agreeing to the religious structures of the time. They killed him because he was a threat to all of that. But what's really interesting there is that in the accepted texts, we only get very limited notions or very limited ideas of Christ.
Right.
Like, there's just those 4 gospels, and it's interesting to look into the history of how and why the books that were accepted to the canon were accepted to the canon for the Bible.
Yeah.
Because then we have all of these other documents, right? Like now, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Nag Hammadi, and looking at these other gospels talking about who Christ was and how he was. And there are a lot of things that, like you're saying, they do not conform to or support religion as an organization. And so there are very many similarities there. And like one of the things to mention about the Red Road too is that there are a lot of people that walk this path or walk an aspect of this path that do not see it as at odds in the least with being Christians.
Right.
And so there's, again, it's a pathway to living and also to understanding that larger consciousness or that larger force that we're a part of.
Right.
One of the other things here too is that I just all of a sudden brought the entire continent, like pan continent, right, of North, Central, and South America together, and I do want to clarify that there are very specific traditions in very specific places. So it's not like this one massive, thing. It's
absolutely
more than anything in talking about this. Like I would say for me, the Red Road has everything to do with the Toltec path of understanding, which is really which is not necessarily the way that other people that are walking the Red Road would refer to it. Some people would lean a lot more towards like Lakota ceremony and towards like or others towards like Diné ways, some people towards the Native American church. So yeah, there's a lot
many
of
different variations,
variability there.
Right.
Absolutely. And I want to be respectful to the fact that they're all there and they all help people in different ways. But so for me, the fundamental thing is this awareness that we are a part of some intelligence that makes all of these phenomenal things happen that come together into what we call life. And that there were people in different parts of the world that spent hundreds of years, thousands of years observing the patterns in the cosmos, in what we think of as nature independent of humans, and in human nature internally, in order to see the fractals, to see and understand that the patterns at the largest level are reflected in the patterns at the smallest level. And that has everything to do with who we are too.
Yeah.
So life in existence is this incredible mystery.
Yeah.
And part of what we're here to do is experience many, many different facets of it.
And yeah.
But in order to experience it to our greatest capacity, we have to heal all of the stuff that we're carrying that clouds our vision.
Right.
That keeps us stuck in unconscious repeated patterns of suffering, really causing suffering to ourselves and causing suffering to others.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
there's a ton
that.
more to talk about, Reuben.
I know there is too. And that's what I find so fascinating about it all, is how, at the end, like this, it's kind of the bigger message of my podcast and what I'm trying to do here is that through every single religion or spirituality, I guess, you can find different aspects of it that help us to better understand ourselves and our purpose here, and also help us to understand that we're all very similar in very different ways, and trying to get at a higher purpose, which is that we all know right from wrong. We all know that there's different things that we should be doing. We all just have different ways of doing it. And maybe by just understanding all of the different ways of doing it, we could combine them in a way to understand how we can be doing it better in different aspects at different times, at different seasons. And so by learning about all of these different ways of how to, in a way, cope with life and how to figure things out, because at the end of the day, who really knows, like there's so much happening in the world and so much nonsense and confusion. Who really knows, And so I love to be able to open up that conversation more often and to be able to have that conversation with more and more people so that we can sort of debunk certain beliefs that people have, and also to expand upon certain beliefs so that we can try to better help understand each other and ourselves throughout the process, because it's madness out there and we all need each other's help. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. I think I've been, not just studying these traditions, but studying spiritual traditions from all over the world for my whole life.
Right.
And it's really interesting when you like dive into the mystic traditions of each of these different belief systems, because there's a big difference between religion and spirituality part, right?
Yeah.
Religion has a set of rules and laws that are imposed from the outside.
Well, I really appreciate that. Thank you so much for your words. I think that couldn't have been more beautifully put and said. And so I really, really do appreciate your time and for you coming on and to talking to us more about this and diving more into it. And I'm sure there are so many more questions and so many things we could talk about, but I think this is a great place to end it. And maybe we can come back and revisit this sometime in the future too. Maybe in person sometime too. I appreciate you. Thank you so much, Oscar, again. And please, everyone, go look into his stuff, because it is incredible and something I have also looked into a little bit too. And I find it so fascinating and has helped me a lot out as well. So thank you so much, Oscar. Thank you for joining us on We're Oblivious. And I guess we'll catch everybody on the next episode. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to We're Oblivious. We hope you found this episode as enlightening and entertaining as we did. If you enjoyed what you heard, please consider subscribing, rating, and leaving a review on your favorite podcast platform. Your feedback and support helps us to get our episodes to more people like you. Don't forget to visit our website at we'reoblivious.com. That's all one word, we'reoblivious.com, to access show notes, additional resources, and join our community. You can also follow us on social media, or I guess you can follow me on social media or on Instagram. My Instagram handle is Reuben Bradshaw. That's REUBEN BRADSHAWW. That's 2 W's. To stay updated on upcoming episodes and more behind the scenes content. We love hearing from our listeners, so if you have any questions, topic suggestions, or people you think we should have on, or just want to say hello, please drop us a message at Ruben@we'reoblivious.com. Your input drives the direction of our show. As we wrap up today, remember your support keeps us going, and we can't wait to share more insightful and inspiring content and dialogue with you next time. Until then, thanks for being part of the We're Oblivious community. See you in the next episode.